One phone call later, how I came to own the cottage Roy kept bragging about. The morning it was finally over, I did the most unremarkable thing in the world. I stood at my kitchen counter in Prairie Village, Kansas, and I sorted a shoebox of receipts by month, because tax season doesn't care about anybody's broken heart. There was coffee going cold beside me in the tall green tumbler my daughter Ellie gave me 2 Christmases ago, the one with the little chip of paint gone near the handle where the dishwasher rack keeps catching it. And outside the window, the same wren that had bullied my feeder all June was doing its impatient scolding. And none of it, not one detail of that ordinary Tuesday, knew that the man I had almost married had, 20 minutes earlier, sat across a bank desk and understood that he had lost. I felt no lightning. I felt like a woman folding laundry. That, I have learned, is what the far side of a very long fight actually looks like. But if you want to understand why my hands were so steady over those receipts, you have to know about one image I keep returning to. The way your tongue keeps returning to a sore tooth. It is a phone screen in the dark of my own bedroom, tilted up on the nightstand, and on it a photograph of Roy standing in front of a little stone cottage with his arm around a woman I did not know, and a caption underneath in somebody else's cheerful voice saying that some things are just meant to be. That is the picture. I will come back to it because everything came back to it. To understand this cup of coffee and that green tumbler, and why I sorted receipts instead of screaming, you have to know what happened last spring and the winter before it, and honestly, a good part of the 2 years before that. So let me tell it the way it happened, in order, the way I'd tell it to you if you were sitting at my table and I was refilling your cup whether you asked me to or not. I'm Yara Abernathy. I turned 51 this past March, which still surprises me when I say it out loud, because on the inside, I feel about the same as I did at 34, just with more opinions and worse knees. I have been an accountant for 26 years, the last 19 of them at Howbrook & Reese, a mid-size firm off College Boulevard in Overland Park, where I have my own office now, with a window that looks at a parking garage. And I am, by every honest account, an unglamorous woman. I raised 2 children, Ellie and my son Marcus, mostly on my own after their father left in 2009, and I did it on spreadsheets and coupons and a lot of Sunday night meal prep, and I am not ashamed of a minute of it. My mother, Delphine, who came up in Cape Girardeau in a house with a wringer washer and 8 brothers and sisters, used to tell me that a woman who keeps her own books never has to ask a man where the money went. She said it like a joke. It was not a joke. It turned out to be the most useful thing anyone ever taught me. I met Roy Vance in the fall of 2020 at a grief group of all places, which I only mention because people always assume the villain in a story like this must have been obvious from the first handshake, and he was not. My mother had died that August, and I was raw in a way I hadn't planned for, and I went to a Thursday night group in the basement of a Methodist church in Leawood because Ellie made me promise I'd try one thing that wasn't work. Roy was there because his wife of 22 years had passed in the spring. He was 58 then, a tall man with silver hair he kept very neat, a retired regional manager for a company that distributed medical supplies, and he had the kind of calm, measured way of talking that a woman my age, exhausted from carrying everything, mistakes for strength. He listened. He remembered what you said the week before. When he told the group about his wife, he used complete sentences and never once cried in a way that asked you to take care of him. And I thought at the time that this was a man who had his feet under him. I want to be fair, even now, because the fairness is part of what makes the rest of it sting. The first 2 years with Roy were good, or good enough, or good in the way that a warm coat is good, even if you later find out the lining is cheap. We took our time. We went to the Nelson Atkins on rainy Saturdays and made up unkind names for the abstract paintings. He came to Marcus's graduation from UMKC and stood in the July heat without complaining and shook my son's hand and said the right thing. He learned that I take my coffee with exactly a splash of oat milk and no sugar. and for a while he made it for me every morning we spent together. And there is a particular loneliness in a 50-year-old woman that a cup of coffee made by someone else before you're even awake goes a long way to soothing. He proposed in the spring of 2022 at a little Italian place in Brookside called Casconi's, with a modest ring he'd clearly thought about. And I said yes, and I meant it, and I want that on the record. I was not a fool. I was a woman who had done the arithmetic and decided the numbers came out in favor of not being alone. Here is a thing about me that matters to the whole rest of this. I own things. Quietly. My mother, for all that she raised us thin, had a genius for one thing, which was small real estate. And when she passed, she left me not much cash, but 3 modest properties she'd accumulated over 40 years of skipping vacations: a duplex in Independence, a single-family rental in Raytown, and a plain brick fourplex in a working-class pocket of Kansas City proper, on the Missouri side, the kind of building nobody photographs. I had inherited her instinct along with her buildings, and over the years I'd added 2 more small properties of my own, managed the whole business through an LLC called Delphine Holdings that I named for her, and kept it entirely separate from my regular life. I did not talk about it. It wasn't a secret exactly. It simply never came up, the way you don't announce your cholesterol at a dinner party. Roy knew I did a little real estate on the side. He did not know the shape of it. He never asked, and I have thought a great deal since about what it means that in 3 years he never once asked. The cooling started so slowly I kept explaining it away, which is the part I'm least proud of, and the part I think you'll recognize if any of this has ever happened to you. The first scene I can point to was in the fall of 2023, a Sunday when I'd made a pot roast because his sister Deborah was coming over, and Roy corrected me in front of her. Not cruelly, not with a raised voice, that was never his instrument. He said, lightly, buttering a roll, that I'd always been a little loose with numbers, which was a strange thing to say about a professional accountant, and when I laughed it off, he said it again, more slowly, as if I hadn't understood, and Deborah looked at her plate. It was such a small thing, but he'd chosen a witness for it, and I noticed that, the way I notice when a column doesn't foot even by 11 cents. The second scene was that Christmas. I'd bought him a good wool overcoat from Hall's that I'd saved for, and he'd bought me a subscription to a meal kit service, which sounds thoughtful until you understand that he presented it by saying it might help me learn to plan better, in front of Ellie, who was 26 by then and no fool, and who found me in the kitchen afterward and asked, very quietly, whether I was happy. I told her I was tired, which was true, and not the same thing, and she let it go because I made her let it go. The third scene, and this is where the cruelty stopped being deniable, was in February of 2024. Roy had started, over that winter, talking about a cottage. There was a little stone place he'd found, out near Weston, Missouri, up in the bluffs above the river, a 2-bedroom built in 1931 on about 1.5 acres, with an original limestone fireplace and a wraparound porch, listed at $340,000. He talked about it constantly. He talked about it the way some men talk about a boat. He said we'd retire there, that he could see us growing old on that porch, and I let myself want it, which I now understand was the trap and the bait, both. And then in February, at a dinner with his old work friends, the Kellermans, when Sharon Kellerman asked how the wedding planning was going, Roy said, smiling, that he was still deciding if Yara was a good enough investment. And everyone laughed, and I laughed. And I went to the ladies' room of that restaurant and stood with both hands flat on the cold marble of the counter and looked at a 50-year-old woman in the mirror and did not recognize the way she was letting herself be spoken to. That was the winter of the small deaths, and I'll be honest about my own part because I promised you the truth and not a hero. I kept quiet through all of it. I told myself he was grieving still, 4 years on. I told myself men his age got rigid. I told myself 100 accountants' things about sunk costs and the value of a partnership already built. What I did not do, and this is the thing my mother would have wanted me to notice sooner, is ask myself what I would tell Ellie to do if she came to me and described a man exactly like this. I knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to spend it on myself yet. Now I have to tell you about the offense, the real one, the picture in the dark. And I have to do it carefully because it's the hinge the whole door swings on. In March of 2024, right around my birthday, Roy grew distant in a new way. Not colder, but lighter, distracted, humming sometimes, which for a man who has been contemptuous of you is somehow worse than the coldness. He took a lot of calls in the garage. He started going to the gym at a franchise near his condo in Parkville, across the state line, at odd hours. I'm an accountant, remember? I notice when a pattern that has held for 3 years suddenly changes its shape. And I noticed. And I did the very ordinary, very human, not at all clever thing that I had never once done in all our years together. One Tuesday night in late April, while he was in the shower and his phone lit up on my own nightstand where he'd set it down, I looked. The account belonged to a woman named Courtney Sable. I would learn later that she was 34, that she did marketing for a fitness apparel company, that she and Roy had met at that Parkville gym in January. Her page was public, bright, relentlessly happy. And there, posted 11 days earlier, was the cottage. My cottage, the one on the porch we were going to grow old on, the stone one from 1931 above the river in Weston, and Roy in front of it in a coat I recognized, the good wool one from Hall's, with his arm around Courtney's shoulders, and her caption in that chirping public voice, "Some things are just meant to be. Can't wait to make memories here." 41 people had left little hearts. One of them was Deborah, his sister, who had sat at my table and eaten my pot roast. I want to describe exactly what that was like because betrayal is too smooth a word, too worn from overuse, and I don't want to hand you a worn word. It was more specific than that. It was the particular vertigo of learning that a story you'd been living inside had a second, truer version running underneath it the whole time, and that other people, Deborah, the Kellermans, a woman named Courtney I'd never met, had been reading the true version while I read the decoy. It was the humiliation of the audience. 41 hearts. He hadn't just left me. He'd been letting people watch him leave me, slowly, for months, while I planned a wedding and worried about his grief. I did not confront him that night. I set the phone back down exactly at the angle he'd left it, tilted up against the base of the lamp, and I lay in the dark next to a man I now understood I did not know, and I listened to him fall asleep. And somewhere in those hours, the thing happened that this whole story is really about. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been easier, and Roy could have handled rage. He'd have had a calm, institutional answer for rage, some line about how these things happen and there was no point being dramatic. What happened instead was quieter and far more dangerous to him. Something in me that had been arguing for 3 years simply stopped arguing. The part of me that kept finding reasons to stay sat down and went still. And in the silence it left behind, the accountant took over. And the accountant does not get angry. The accountant reconciles. Let me tell you how Roy operated because it's the key to why what I did to him was the only language he'd actually hear. Roy was never a shouter, never a groveler, never the kind of man who breaks. Roy hid inside systems. When Marcus's father had once tried to renegotiate child support, it was Roy, this was early when he was still trying to be useful to me, who'd advised me on it, and I remembered the way he talked. Nothing personal, just what the paperwork says, just what the agreement allows. He believed, at his core, that a thing done through a document was clean of moral weight. He could sleeve a grieving woman for someone 24 years younger and feel blameless because he'd never technically lied, because he was going to handle the wedding side of things properly, because there was going to be paperwork. That was Roy's whole soul, if you want to know it. He thought the rules were a place you could hide from being a person. I decided that night to meet him inside the rules and to be waiting there when he arrived. The next morning, I made my own coffee in the green tumbler, and I did not say a word. And I want you to understand that this silence was not weakness. It was the first move. Because here is what Roy did not have the imagination to consider. I already held a card, and I'd been holding it, unplayed, for 2.5 years. His mother, Eleanor Vance, who was 79 and whom I genuinely loved, lived in a tidy 2-bedroom apartment in a well-kept building in Gladstone, north of the river, and had lived there for 11 years, and had a rent that had barely moved in all that time because her landlord was a good sort. Eleanor said that often. Her landlord was a good sort. Eleanor did not know that her landlord was Delphine Holdings, and that Delphine Holdings was me. I had bought that building in 2021, the year after my mother died, 6 months after I met Roy, entirely by coincidence. It had come up at a foreclosure auction, and it penciled out, and I'd bought it the way I bought buildings, quietly, through the LLC, and only realized whose mother lived in Unit 4 when Roy mentioned the address one evening, and my stomach did a slow, strange turn. I had never told him. It had felt for 2 years like an awkward thing to bring up, and then like a private thing to keep, and then, that April, like something else entirely. So there it was. I was the landlord of the building that housed the mother of the man who'd been posting our retirement cottage online with another woman. And I had never once used it, never hinted at it, never let it color a single Sunday dinner. That, I think, is the part people find hardest to believe. Not that I had the power, but that I'd sat on it so long without touching it. But that's exactly the woman my mother raised. You don't spend a card because you're angry. You spend it once, cleanly, when spending it settles the whole account. I called Nancy Okonkwo the following Monday. Nancy is a real estate and family law attorney I've worked with for 15 years, since she handled the closing on the Raytown house. A sharp, funny woman of about my age, with a corner office and a converted shoe factory in the crossroads, and a laugh you can hear through a closed door. I did not go to her crying. I went to her with a folder. That's a thing about me. When I'm hurt past a certain point, I get organized. And organizing is how I keep from drowning. I laid out the whole picture for her, the engagement, the cottage, Courtney's public posts, which I had by then screenshotted with dates and archived, the ownership structure of Delphine Holdings, the building in Gladstone. Nancy listened to all of it with her chin on her fist, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Yara, I have to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it. What do you want out of this? Because you can do almost anything you want here, and the thing you want is going to decide everything else." I remember the question landing on me like a weight I hadn't known I could set down. What did I want? Not what did I want to do to Roy. What did I want for myself at 51 on the other side of this? And I sat in Nancy's office with the L train rattling past her window, and I found that I did not want to burn his mother's building down around her. I did not want Eleanor, who used to save me the good Danish when I visited, put out on the street to punish her son. I did not want to become, in the getting of my dignity back, a person my mother would have been ashamed of. What I wanted was smaller and much harder. I wanted to say no more, all the way, out loud, in a way Roy could not smile his way around. And then I wanted to be free and warm and done. "Then here's what we're going to do," Nancy said, and she started to write. The preparation took a little under 6 weeks, and I lived a strange double life through all of it, which was its own kind of education. On the surface, I was still engaged to Roy. I still saw him twice a week. I still let him make his little corrections and heard him talk about the future in that light, distracted way. And it turns out you can do that. You can pour a man his coffee and discuss the guest list while a lawyer quietly builds the exit around you, if you have decided in your bones that you are already gone. I felt, in those weeks, like a woman watching a house she used to live in from across the street. It should have felt cold. Mostly, it felt like relief that had learned to wait. Here's what we assembled. First, the divorce and disentanglement side, which Nancy handled. Because we weren't yet married, there was blessedly little to unwind. But Roy had, over the previous year, gotten his name onto a joint checking account we'd opened for the wedding, and had quietly moved into it about $19,000 of our combined deposits, and had been treating it as a shared pot he was entitled to draw on. Nancy documented every dollar. Second, and this is the part that mattered, the cottage itself. Because while Roy had been posting pictures of the stone house in Weston as though it were his, Roy did not actually own it. He had been in negotiations, yes. He had a verbal understanding with the seller, an older widower named Mr. Prentice, who wanted an easy sale. And Roy had been dragging his feet on the financing the way careful men do, treating the whole thing as settled because his intention felt to him as good as a deed. It was, in other words, still on the market. It was still, legally, nobody's. I bought it, in cash, through Delphine Holdings in the third week of May for $328,000, which was $12,000 under the asking price because Mr. Prentice liked that I could close in 11 days and would not make him wait on a bank. I bought the cottage that Roy had bragged about, the porch we were going to grow old on, the caption that said, "Some things are just meant to be." I signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon in Nancy's office, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel when you finally set down a bag you didn't realize how long you'd been carrying, a deep, aching, physical relief in the shoulders. The cottage was mine. Roy did not know. Courtney did not know. 41 Hearts did not know. And then Nancy and I set the last piece, which was the timing and the place and the phone call. Roy had that spring been trying to arrange the financing for the cottage through a bank in Riverside, a suburb of Kansas City on the Missouri side, at a branch where a loan officer named Doug Feltner had been slow-walking his application. Roy, being Roy, had scheduled a meeting there for the first Friday in June to get things moving, and had, this is the detail that still makes me shake my head, asked me to come along because I understood the numbers, as though I were a calculator he could bring in a bag. He had not yet told me he was leaving. He was still, as far as he knew, running 2 lives at once, and he genuinely intended to sit me down in a bank and have me help him vet the loan on the house he was buying to live in with a 34-year-old. I said yes. I said I'd love to. Nancy nearly fell out of her chair when I told her the plan had arranged itself. So now we come to it. Back to the present of that story, the first Friday in June, the bank office in Riverside, the phone call that gave the whole thing its name. The branch was a low, tan brick building with a drive-through and a flag out front, and Doug Feltner's office was a glass box off the lobby with a laminate desk and 2 chairs and a bowl of those strawberry hard candies that every bank in America seems to buy from the same supplier. Roy wore a blazer. He'd shaved close, and he smelled like the cedar cologne he saved for occasions. And when we sat down, he did the thing he always did, which was to answer the officer's questions on my behalf before I could speak, to explain to Doug that his fiancé handled the books and would keep us honest. Doug was maybe 40, tired, professionally kind. He had the file open, and he said gently the sentence that started the landslide. "Mister?" Mance, before we go further, I do have to flag that the property's showing as under contract and now recorded as sold as of last week. Are you aware there's been a transaction? I watched Roy's face do something I had never seen it do in 3 years. It didn't crumble. Roy didn't crumble. That wasn't in him. But it froze, the way water freezes, from the surface down, and underneath the frozen surface, you could see him start to compute. Sold. To whom? How? He said, with the first crack of real tension in that smooth voice, that there must be a mistake, that he'd had an understanding with Mr. Prentice, that these things took time. Doug, uncomfortable, said the record was clear. The buyer was an entity, an LLC. The sale had closed on the 22nd of May. And this was the moment. I had rehearsed nothing. Nancy had told me to say as little as possible and let the documents talk, and she was right, and I found when I opened my mouth that I did not want a speech anyway. I took my phone out of my purse, the same nightstand phone from the night in the dark, and I laid it flat on Doug Feltner's laminate desk, and I said, "There's no mistake, Doug. I can tell you exactly who bought it. It's one phone call if you want to verify." And I called Nancy, on speaker, right there, and Nancy answered on the second ring and confirmed, in her crisp closing attorney voice, that the property at that address in Weston had been purchased on May 22nd by Delphine Holdings, LLC, all cash, and that the sole member and manager of Delphine Holdings, LLC was Ms. Yara Abernathy, and that title was clear and recorded and unencumbered. Then I hung up, and I looked at Roy, and I said the plainest sentence of my life. "I bought the cottage, Roy. I own it. I've owned it since before you and Courtney posted your pictures in front of it. I wish I could describe the silence, but I promised not to use the worn words for it, so I'll tell you what actually happened in his face instead." Roy did not go pale, and he did not beg. Roy retreated, the way he always retreated, into procedure. He said, after a long moment, that this was a very aggressive thing to do, that there were ways these things are supposed to be handled, that I should have come to him. He said the word inappropriate. And I understood, watching him reach for the rule book to hide behind even now, that I had read him exactly right. And I felt something I hadn't expected, which was not vindication so much as a strange, calm pity. The way you feel watching someone try to lock a door in a house that's already been sold out from under them. Because I wasn't finished, and the next part was the mercy, and the mercy was the point. I told him, still quietly, in front of Doug Feltner, who by now had put down his pen and stopped pretending this was a loan meeting, that I knew about Courtney, that I'd known for weeks, that I had every screenshot with every date. I told him our joint wedding account had been reconciled, and that Nancy had documented the $19,000 he'd drawn against it, and that I would be recovering what was mine and not $1 more, and that the ring could stay wherever he'd like to put it. And then I told him the last thing, the thing I had thought about the most, the thing I could have used as a knife and chose to use as a door. "I know about your mother's building in Gladstone," I said. "I've known for 2 years. I'm the one who owns it. Eleanor's landlord, the good sort she's always talking about, is me. I've kept her rent flat for 2 years because I love her. And Roy, I want you to hear this part clearly. I am going to keep doing that. Nothing about Eleanor changes. Not her rent, not her lease, not one thing. I could have made your mother's life very hard this month to make a point to you. And I want you to spend a long time understanding that I chose not to." That was when Roy finally understood the shape of what had happened to him. And it wasn't that he'd lost a cottage, or a fiancé, or $19,000. It was that he had spent 3 years being cold and careful and institutional, with a woman who could have leveled him with a single filing, and had instead quietly held the high ground the entire time, and was now handing him his own mother's safety as a gift he hadn't earned. He had thought I was the loose with numbers one. He had thought I was the investment he was still deciding on. And there is no rule book, no paperwork, no nothing personal that a man can hide behind when someone shows him mercy he knows he would never have shown in return. He didn't have an answer for it. For the first time since I'd known him, Roy Vance sat in a chair with nothing to manage. He said my name once, Yara, in a different voice, a smaller one. And I stood up, and I picked my phone up off the desk, and I thanked Doug Feltner for his time. And I told Roy that Nancy would be in touch about the account, and that he should probably let Courtney know the cottage was off the table. And then I walked out through the tan brick lobby, past the bowl of strawberry candies, into the June parking lot, and I sat in my Honda for a minute with my hands in my lap, and I did not cry, and I did not celebrate. I just sat there and breathed, a 51-year-old woman who had finally, all the way through, said no more. And I noticed that my hands, which I had half expected to be trembling, were only warm and open and still. So now you know why, on that ordinary Tuesday a few weeks later, I was standing at my counter in Prairie Village sorting receipts into a shoebox by month, while the wren scolded my feeder and the coffee went cold in the green tumbler with the chip near the handle. Because it was over. Not dramatically over the way a long invoice is finally over when the last line is entered and the total foots to the penny. Roy took the break the way he took everything, through procedure. He had Deborah return a box of my things to Nancy's office, and he wrote me one email, 3 paragraphs, cool and blameless, in which he never once said he was sorry, only that he hoped I'd found the outcome I was after. I had. It just wasn't the outcome he imagined. He thought I'd been after him. I'd been after myself. Here is what I kept, because my mother taught me that you measure a life by what you keep and not by what you take. And I want to end on the keeping. I kept the cottage, and I did not sell it out of spite, which everyone assumed I would. Instead, that August, I drove up to Weston with Ellie and Marcus, and we sat on the wraparound porch above the river with lemonade and old jelly jars, and Ellie asked me why I'd bought it, really. And I told her the truth, which was that I'd wanted, just once, to own the thing I'd been told I wasn't good enough to be given. Now it's the family place. Marcus proposed to his girlfriend Priya there last month on that same porch, and I stood in the doorway of the kitchen I paid $328,000 for and watched a good young man do a brave thing well. And I thought that no story about Roy would ever be worth as much as that one moment. And it wasn't. I kept Eleanor. I never told her the whole of it, only that Roy and I had parted, and that nothing about her home would ever change. And I still visit her on the second Sunday of the month, and she still saves me the good Danish, and her rent is exactly what it was. Because a promise made from strength that costs you something is the only kind that means anything. And I meant it. I kept Nancy, who took me to dinner at a Lebanese place in the Crossroads the week it was all filed, and raised a glass of arak and said, "To the loose with numbers, girl." And we laughed so hard the table next to us asked what was funny, and we couldn't explain it, and we didn't try. And I paid off the last of Marcus's student loans that same month, $12,000 and change, quietly, through the account, because that is what my mother would have done with a good year. She'd have turned it into somebody else's easier morning. And I kept the green tumbler. It's still chipped. My daughter keeps offering to replace it, and I keep telling her no, that the chip is where it catches on the dishwasher rack, that I like knowing exactly where a thing is worn, and choosing to keep it anyway. She thinks I'm being sentimental about a cup. I'm not. I'm being sentimental about a whole self I nearly gave away to a man who told me, at a dinner table full of laughing people, that he was still deciding if I was a good enough investment. He decided wrong. It turned out I was the whole bank.